So Day, you can go ahead and control the screen and move forward as you'd like.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, everyone. So before we jump in, I wanted to give you all a little bit of context of who we are and why Aubrey and I have been working so closely together. Back in 2018, just prior to the legislative session, we convened the Renters' Rights Roundtable. And this is really a coalition of different housing organizations and organizers that were really working at the local and state level. The one thing that we realized throughout the 2016 and the 2017 legislative session was that it's great that we're all working individually, but it's better to have our collective power together at the table. So the Renters' Rights Roundtable is comprised of the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, CCLP, 9 to 5, United for a New Economy, and a few others that I'd be happy to share with you all if you're interested in engaging them in a conversation. I also thought it would just be helpful to talk a little bit about Mile High Connects, because as an organization, we can be, it's a little unclear of how we're involved in a lot of this work. So Mile High Connects is a collaborative that formed in 2011, and we've really been engaged in this housing conversation around a couple of different areas. One is through the transit system, right? The RTD light rail system as it was being built out really caused us to create and to really wrestle with some questions around affordability and ease of access for folks to be able to get to and from their doctor's appointments, how they're able to get to and from good paying jobs, and how they're able to really live their lives. So we became engaged in this work really through our collaborative partners, 9 to 5, United for a New Economy, and Enterprise, who are really on the ground working with legislators, working with folks and policymakers to make change happen in our region. And I would be happy to talk a little bit more about Mile High Connects if folks are interested after the call. Before we jump into really the conversation around health and housing, I thought it would just be helpful to give you all a quick overview of housers and how housing entities typically talk about the work. We have our own dictionary, so I just have a couple of items on the screen right now, and these are things that we'll mention at some point, or you'll hear at least in some point during the presentation. Just wanted to give you all enough to be dangerous and at least have a sense of what the housers are talking about. So of course, affordable housing, that's kind of the framework of this conversation. And it really varies when we think about what area median income is, which is the second one. Community development corporations, you often hear those as the developers, local nonprofit developers that are actually doing the work. There's also a couple of notes that you'll hear in this presentation as source of income. And that really gets to the core of the variety of ways that we get money, right? What's the source of income that you receive? So think about public housing assistance, disability, child support, those kinds of things. The other is warranty of habitability. And this requires a landlord to maintain a minimum standard of health and safety when they think about their rental units and things that they own. I don't have the definitions up on the screen, but at the very end in the appendix, that gives you the specific definitions, and that will be shared with you all afterwards. But I wanted to at least get us kind of on a baseline understanding of some terms and things that we're gonna chat about. All right, so let's get into some of the data and what does it really look like for our communities. And a lot of you, because of the work that you're in, you are aware of these data points just because we see it on a daily basis, right? Either through the health lens or even just walking around in our communities. So when we look at the reality of affordability, specifically through a homelessness lens, in our region, in the state, there are about 10,000 folks that are homeless or housing insecure. A lot of these folks are children. So when we talk about affordable housing, we're really talking about the family and how it affects family units, how it affects not only individuals, but children at the end of the day. When we look at the number of students that are experiencing homelessness, it has certainly expanded. And at the last count was about 21,000 folks When we think about that under the context of gentrification and displacement and a lot of these pressures, it really starts to frame a conversation around housing that it's no longer about an individual, right? It's about us as a community and each of the systems that we all work within. So I want to take another step and look at housing specifically for renters and how these two are really related. Mile High Connects really became involved in conversations around housing and displacement from a lens of transportation, because when we were talking to folks, and we being our organizing partners, 9 to 5 and United for a New Economy, we were finding out that folks were spending close to 50% of their paycheck on housing plus transportation costs, especially for extremely low income individuals. So we recently pushed for an affordable fare program with RTD that will be implemented in the summer to ease that burden on our renters. But when we look at Colorado, 50% of Colorado renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing specifically. And these numbers are probably actually a little out of date. Bell Policy recently released their self-sufficiency standard, which I think actually increased the hourly rate that's required for a 2-bedroom rental in the Denver metro area. So we're looking at housing, we're looking at transportation costs. Folks are really bearing a lot of the burden really on their shoulders, and really it's having a deep impact on their health when we start to think about how they go about their daily lives. So this is a slide that we partnered with our data partners at Shift Research to do some perspective, really framing the perspective of who can actually afford to live in the Denver metro area. So the slide that I have just shows you the reality of affordability from just one of the many sectors that we have, specifically looking at janitors, right? We have another slide that shows where can nurses live in the Denver metro area, but I wanted to show this one because these are often folks that work backbreaking jobs. They typically, when you look at where they're living and where they're working in our city center, right? They're working in these job hubs throughout the region, but where can they afford to actually live? And if you look at the screen, there are very few green spots on where someone can afford to actually live and where the housing unit numbers are fairly high. So you'll see up in the Green Valley Ranch, Montbello area, that there's one concentration, at least, of affordable housing. And this is data that is likely outdated at this point. This was completed for Mile High Connects back in 2017, and now we're 2 years into a lot of the pressures that we've been feeling more recently around housing and housing affordability. So it wouldn't surprise me if we were to pull this data and take another closer look at it, that this has probably decreased as far as where folks can live within the Denver metro area. And like I said, I'd be happy to share other segments that we've done more recently. So one thing that we often hear from folks is, well, why don't we just build more affordable housing units? And that's a common phrase that we hear from folks in the community that may not be aware of what is happening in our region. As many of you all probably know, the cost of land is just very high right now. So that's creating some burden and some added pressures. The other piece of pressure that we've heard from folks is really around the workforce. There are, at least in 2016, 2017, we were, and we still are, experiencing a shortage, of trained construction workers to be able to build the affordable housing units that we need. So at the end of the day, we're working with a shortage of units. What you see right now on your screen, specifically looking affordable units. We have about 94 available and affordable units for every 100 families. I'm sorry, I may be reading that wrong. Or no, sorry, that is actually wrong. There are only 27 affordable and available units for folks that are at 100 or at 30% AMI. So when we're thinking about AMI, area median income, 80% for a family is roughly about $45,000, $40,000 a year. 30% AMI gets a little bit lower. So this is extremely, not extremely low income, but definitely low income, right around $20,000 a year. So when we look at the region, we need about 62,000 or so affordable units, and about 86,000 units for folks at 50% AMI. And that's in the Denver metro area. So when we look at Denver, Aurora, Lakewood, Westminster, Thornton, that's really where we're talking about. So why health and housing? And what you see on the screen is just a snippet of a study that was done. I believe it was by Robert Wood Johnson. And when we talk about housing, and again, this is something that you all as experts in your industry are far more familiar than what we certainly are. But what we're really trying to do is bridge the conversations between healthy housing and everything that makes up a person's daily life, right? It's no longer about health being in a silo, but really how someone's inability to access affordable housing adds additional pressures to them when they think about employment opportunities, when they think about where they can afford to live and whether there's violence that's happening in the community. Another just example that we've looked at and that many of you are familiar with is, of course, the development that's proposed along Central 70 and the just air quality and a lot of the actual environmental factors that are of concern, at least for folks in those communities. So really, when we're talking about housing, we're talking about how it affects every aspect of somebody's daily life, including their emotional and health and well-being. So what is being done? I mentioned at the beginning of the call that Aubrey, who is my fellow co-presenter, isn't able to be here with us today because she's presenting around some key legislation to legislators at the state capitol. So through this Renters' Rights Collaborative, or Renters' Rights Protections Roundtable, there's been a number of bills that are being introduced in this legislative session to hopefully address some of the key issues that we've heard from community residents and from community leaders when it comes to how we can all create a better housing or a better system for housing here in the state. So these are bills that are currently being introduced or will be introduced at the state legislation this year. The grants for property tax and rent relief, the rental application fees, time to cure, lease violations, residential tenant and health safety act, which is a warranty of habitability. And I'm only going to touch on a couple of these to just give you a sense of how folks might be interested in engaging and what's really coming down the pike. The first one that I want to touch on is warranty of habitability. This bill is really looking to hold landlords accountable to make sure that they're creating and ensuring a safe environment for their tenants. This is one thing that we've heard time and time again from our organizing partners 9 to 5 when we think about manufactured homes, when we think about apartments. You may have seen a story recently about an apartment complex in Inglewood where tenants were provided very, it's really disgusting, but they were provided essentially a piece of paper that explained to them how they could take care of their own pest issues, which really did not even solve the issue. And it was honestly disgusting how the landlord kind of pursued this with such nuance and said, well, just, if you have a pest, just put out some duct tape and that'll solve the issue, rather than actually coming in and putting an exterminator. So essentially, they were proposing and keeping some dangerous environments for folks. So this bill is really focused on ensuring that if an issue is brought to a landlord, that they take action within 24 hours if it is particularly dangerous or hazardous to the tenant's life, health, or safety, and 72 hours to fix the issue if the premises is uninhabitable, or if somebody just cannot be within the space. This really looks at refrigerators, ovens, heat. So it's really looking at how folks are engaging in their spaces. The other key component of this is related to mold and ensuring that mold remediation is included. This was brought to the Healthcare and Human Services Committee earlier this month. We're happy to say that it passed, and it's passed committee once more, so we do anticipate it being presented to the legislature this year. So that's exciting news for us, and we're looking forward to, again, building up support and building up momentum for folks to be able to get folks properly housed in safe housing. The other bill that we're looking at, again, when we think about stress and stressors that are on our folks' lives, are really around rental application fees. So one thing that you all may have heard really early, especially during the boom, which we continue to feel in the Denver metro area, was that landlords were charging exorbitant amounts for application fees, often on site. So if I'm going and looking for an apartment, they're wanting $1,700, $1,800 right then and there. So administrative costs and basically every single fee. For someone with limited means, with someone that may not have a lot of savings, with someone that is already feeling the pressures just of being life, application fees can mean not accessing healthy food at the end of the day, not accessing medications, not accessing proper health care. So for us, we're really focused on how do we put a limit on what a landlord can charge for an application fee to keep it to the actual cost. Let's not add all of these additional things to simply make a profit on the backs of folks that really need a safe house to live in. The other piece that we were hearing from a lot of folks really in 2016, 2014, was that landlords were not necessarily giving folks notice that they were declined. So we also wanted to include that as an added protection to ensure that especially our most vulnerable folks are getting taken care of. This bill did pass and is now going on to the second reading on the House floor. So we'll continue to watch that, and of course encourage folks to reach out to the representatives if you see them listed as one of the sponsors, and ensure that that we continue to move this forward. The other bill that's currently being proposed is the grants for property tax rent and heat. And this was being, my understanding, this was being really pushed for by the area on aging. This is something that they're really looking at. So through Dr. Cogg's Agency on Aging, really looking at how we can help low-income seniors and individuals who are eligible for assistance to offset their property taxes or rent. The interesting part is that this also includes heat and fuel expenses, which I think is a new component, or my understanding is that that's a new component that wasn't previously there. And the goal of this, again, was really to take care of our most vulnerable folks, right? So folks that may not necessarily have access to different rebate opportunities, but how do we get them to be able to stay in place, especially for our aging seniors, to be able to stay in the homes that they either own or that they're currently renting, to be able to maintain safe housing as well. This one also passed through the House Finance, and so now it's on to the House Appropriations. And we're going to continue monitoring this to see what some opportunities might be for folks to engage. You'll see that Senator Zenzinger out of Arvada is on this, so we want to make sure that she knows that we support and are willing to offer our leadership and thought partnership with her as questions and as concerns come up. So I think that's one way that folks on the call can certainly engage in this conversation. And then the last one that I wanted to bring up is the source of income non-discrimination. This one has not been introduced yet, but definitely has some deep interest here locally in the Denver metro area. The city and county of Denver, had started to explore this, and I believe they passed this last year to do it at a local level, ensuring that folks are not discriminated against based on their source of income. So we know a lot of folks are receiving child support. We know a lot of folks receive disability benefits, veterans benefits. Right now, a landlord could say to an individual looking for housing that is not income, that's not seen as a valid source of income, although it makes up a person's what we like to call their whole paycheck, right? It's a source of income to them. It helps them live their daily life. So this bill is ensuring that regardless of the individual source of income, that they are not discriminated against from accessing affordable housing, that they're not being discriminated against from accessing safe housing. We do anticipate that this one will hopefully move forward. We're still monitoring it. Again, since the city and county of Denver moved forward on this, we're not too certain, but we're feeling pretty confident that this will move forward in this legislative session. So something that, while it's not been introduced, we certainly want to keep folks aware of. I'm going to go. The other one that I want to mention that is not on this list, and the one that Aubrey is actually presenting on today, is around eviction protection. So that's another bill that our partners are deeply invested in to ensure that folks are not, or that folks are provided rather an adequate amount of time to be able to find a new home, to be able to transfer schools for their children. Currently, under Colorado state law, folks have 3 days, or a landlord could give somebody 3 days to essentially move out of their existing home or their existing apartment. What we're proposing is that we need a longer time frame. I believe we're proposing 7 days on that bill. And that's really to ensure that folks have adequate time to be able to find safe housing, or at least have time to find safe housing, versus just essentially being forced into homelessness as a result of a landlord acting scrupulously. What we were seeing, and many of you are probably familiar with this, especially during the boom, was that a lot of landlords were essentially evicting folks sight unseen for very minor offenses. And so we really want to ensure that folks have time and are able to prepare themselves for what's coming down the pipe. And I'd be happy to share additional information on that one as well. So what is your role really in the conversation? This is something, let me go back one. There we go. The one thing we always want to encourage folks to do is, track these bills at the legislative level. Many of these representatives work in our hometowns. They're very invested in making sure that the bills that are being proposed serve the communities, and communities being our neighbors, being our residents, being our leaders, in a way that serves them the most. The other thing that I would really encourage you all to do is reach out to your legislators to let them know that you're supportive of these bills, and that you certainly hope that they'll vote yes. In previous efforts that we've done around housing legislation, it's always it's always been a refreshing voice to have others that are involved in these conversations come to the table. Oftentimes it's mainly housing organizations and housing leaders, but if we can start to encourage others that also see the effects of housing and housing insecurity to reach out to legislators, it can be really transformative to them. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is really thinking about how you as organizations or you as an individual can lend your voice to the conversation. So certainly drafting supportive op-eds and submitting it to news outlets can be a real game changer, because oftentimes the conversation is really focused around housing itself. But what we really want to do is shift the narrative that it's not housing, right? We're talking about our community as a whole. We're talking about how folks are experiencing the stressors of the lack of affordable housing. And so we really want to encourage you all to help us shift and reframe the narrative to make it much more representative of what we're actually seeing in our communities. And then the last way to engage, of course, if you're so inclined to do, is testify in committee. In fact, if you're really feeling up for it and want to testify today, Aubrey is hearing testimony or providing testimony starting at 1 o'clock. So there's always an opportunity for you to testify, and Mile High Connects, as well as folks around the Renters' Rights Table, are certainly not encouraging you to do this on your own. We're here to serve as thought partners and want to serve as thought partners with you all. So if there is just a question that you have, or you aren't quite sure how to frame it or phrase it, we have an abundance of talking points and social media posts that we'd be happy to share in various toolkits that make it easier for you. The last thing that we want to do is just add another item onto your to-do list. So if we can be of support, that's really what we want to do as you think about how you want to engage in the conversation. I also just wanted to include some tips on being a good ambassador, because I know that's something that we often hear. And I'm ready to engage and really ready to have a conversation with my legislator, but how do I do this, right? What should I do? The one thing that we always encourage folks is, don't feel like you have to know everything. Housing is a complex issue, and even today we've only scratched the surface, right? We know barely enough to be dangerous to at least engage in a conversation, but definitely just open yourself up and have that vulnerability and engage in a way that really ties how you connect to this conversation. I think that's a key piece, especially for a lot of our legislators and for a lot of our leaders in the region, right? They aren't quite sure how you as an individual or you as an organization are connected to this issue. So that's something that we definitely want to encourage you to do. The other thing that I would encourage you to take into account is really how you as an individual and how your expertise lends to the conversation around housing and health and accessibility. And again, this is something where Mile High Connects and our partners, Enterprise, 9 to 5 and UNE would be more than happy to kind of lend our support and to lend our perspective and see how these two intersect, so that you don't feel like you're kind of going into the conversation completely blind. The other thing that I would just encourage you all to do is, as you're having these conversations, to the extent that you feel comfortable, call out that you're part of a coalition of some of other renters and of folks that are engaged in this conversation, because it really lends to the narrative that this is no longer just a conversation that housers are having, but rather it's a regional conversation that we're having around housing and how it affects our daily lives. So I mentioned to Marissa this was going to be a short presentation since Aubrey was not here to really lend her expertise. But I did want to just thank you all for spending some time with us. I have a couple of contacts on the screen myself, my email information. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you all about Mile High Connects or the work that we do. Tiana Patterson with Enterprise Community Partners has been our our lead really when we think about our policy work. And Aubrey Hasfold with Colorado Coalition from the Homeless is another amazing resource to reach out to around specific issue areas. But with that, I'll stop and take a few questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Day. I appreciate you talking us through all of these bills and everything that is absolutely imperative for us to be thinking about as people working in public health who interact with housing all the time. A few questions that we have from the Zoom chat thus far, I'll just read out, and these look mostly like clarifying questions so far, but the first question is if you could define communities, and I think this came up when you were going through that slide with the numbers. Is that Denver Metro, the Front Range, etc.?
Yeah, so my understanding is that that's specifically in the Denver metro area. I'd be happy to get the broader numbers for the state, but I'll also clarify with Aubrey on that specific point.
Great. And the other clarification was also about how student homelessness was counted and whether it was not counted in the total number for that first data slide as well.
Yeah, so my understanding is that the student homelessness was not in the total population. I believe that was a separate, that's separate. The other thing that I'll just note about student homelessness, and this is based on some conversations that we've had with our partners at Shift Research Lab, is that student homelessness at times can seem a little unclear. We're really basing it off of certain data sets that are shared from school districts and others in the state of Colorado. At least a lot of school districts kind of keep that close to their chest. So if you're interested in kind of exploring the data sets and exploring more information around that, I would keep an eye out for the Regional Equity Atlas. This is a resource that Mile High Connects and Shift Research Lab have been working on for well over 5 years, but we're looking at a broader statewide equity atlas that overlays homelessness and hopefully some education data as well. So that's something to keep an eye out on.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. And then I'm going to go ahead. I see Nami has her hand raised. So Nami, I'm going to go ahead and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. So I hear that, thanks for all of this, and especially thank you for the calls to action and follow-up tips. So you're talking about place and region, and I'm in Boulder County. I know everyone thinks we're really rich. About 20% of us are living below the federal poverty line. And of course, AMI, that puts us at about 37% of us are living in sort of housing constraints. And you know, Claire Levy, who is at the CCLP, has talked a lot about looking less at geographic restrictions and more at linguistic isolation when it comes to talking about housing. And I'm wondering what the benefits are to you of talking about geography versus, you know, people who are English speaking and people who are native born. And I guess as a follow-up question to that, you know, I'm just wondering also if there is anything to be said about Indigenous voices in this conversation. Are there Indigenous leaders who are co-leading this conversation, given that we are mostly, many of us are settlers on this land, and to what extent is that recognized?
Yeah. Yes, no, I think those are both great questions. When I look at so I guess I can back up a little bit. Prior to the current administration, the current federal administration, the regions were working on affirmatively furthering fair housing, which was really intended to look at exactly what you're referring to, Nami, around linguistic isolation and really how all of these things intersect when we talk about housing and housing accessibility across cultures and specifically within the Denver metro area. We were looking at it from a geography simply because the data sets that were available, but the cities that were participating in that in that study, and it wasn't really a study, but it was more of a survey. So it was Denver, Boulder, and Aurora that were participating in that. Under the current administration, though, as you all are probably familiar with, Ben Carson was not very interested in moving that further. And so I think what we're starting to see is here at a regional level, how can we start to look at that? How can we look at that a little bit differently? I'm not as familiar, and I probably just need to circle back around with Claire on that, because I think she brings up a really good point. We've been looking at it from a geography lens, but we do look at it also from a cultural lens to the extent that we can. And that's definitely something that Jennifer at Shift Research Labs has been interested in looking at closer. And can you repeat the second question for me?
Yeah, by and large, many of the people who are involved, especially in Boulder, in housing conversations are settlers, right? We are not indigenous to this land. And I'm curious as to what indigenous voices, Native American voices are co-creating these policies, involved in these policies. Who's been consulted from Native American Rights Fund, for example, for helping to write these bills. To what extent have they been consulted or participated in? When we talk about the cost of land or the mining of materials for building and so on, to me, they're not my land, and I want very much to have those voices lead the charge. So I'm curious about how much that's happening at a state level.
Yes. I will only speak for myself and not for Mile High Connects. From my perspective, we have not done enough. We have not done enough to engage Indigenous communities in the conversation around housing. Typically what I see in these spaces around housing conversations are definitely folks, again, this is totally from my side. I'm very much speaking for myself. It's typically white dominant cultures that you see represented. Something that Mile High Connects has been really committed to, and several of our partners have been very committed to, is ensuring that community leaders have a voice at those tables when it comes to housing policies. I think one example is really around some of the organizing efforts that 9 to 5 has been doing around a mobile home manufactured housing park in Aurora. And so I know that they've engaged their community resident leaders to specifically meet with city managers, meet with the county, meet with folks to have those conversations. So it's not necessarily 9 to 5 that's presenting the policies, but rather the folks that are impacted. I will, again, just share that the Indigenous communities, specifically Native American populations, have not been as involved in these conversations. And again, speaking for myself personally, I think that they really should be more represented in the conversation. I don't think that fully answered your question, but I'd be happy to talk offline as well.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for being frank.
Great. Thank you, Nami, for your great questions. So if anybody else would also like to ask a question out loud today, feel free and raise your hand through the raise hand feature on the participants tab. You can also type into the Zoom chat now. And as we're waiting for additional people to ask questions, Dea, I was curious if you might be able to share a bit about what I've heard through the city as the city's initiative called NEST, Neighborhood Equity and Stability Team, and how you feel like the city is engaging with this, as well as your organization and partners.
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about NEST. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the city and county of Denver hired directors who really take on neighborhood stabilization and the issue of gentrification and displacement to the extent that they could, really looking at policies, really looking at early interventions, and really looking at opportunities to ensure that we weren't displacing folks in our community, in our region. So that director is Irene Aguilar, Dr. Irene Aguilar. She's a former senator, and so she really brings a policy perspective to the conversation. She has been, I will say, a really great ally in thinking through how the city can kind of shift some of their own internal policies to do better. She's been very invested in conversations around Westwood and what's called the West Denver Renaissance Collaborative. So for those of you that might not be familiar, this is really a collaborative that was brought together by BHA, Denver Housing Authority, to look at how we could preserve place in Westwood, Via Park, Athmar Park, Barnum, and then a couple of other neighborhoods on the west side of Denver. This is really centered around community engagement, and I know that Irene, in her position as the NEST director, is really focused around how can we create more affordable housing, but also preserve wealth in those areas. So you all may have seen some news around ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, specifically looking at folks that own their homes and maybe want to put a granny flat in the back and provide it as affordable housing to somebody either in their family or in their neighborhood. She's also, my understanding is that she's really focused around business preservation. That's another really key component of just maintaining place. It's one thing to have a small business in a neighborhood. It's a very different thing to have a Target or a Walmart. And so really thinking about how do we look at all of the factors that make a community and a neighborhood a neighborhood. And so she's really focused on business preservation as well. So that's my extent and my knowledge of kind of where that's going. I think there's always an opportunity to continue the conversation. I will say from our perspective, the health voice is definitely missing at that table. And I think it would be great to have folks that are engaged in those conversations, because again, when we think about everything, there's always a health component to it. And so I think that would be really valuable. The other thing that I didn't mention, because it wasn't part of this conversation, but Nami's questions really brought it up, or sparked something in my mind, is really around the concept of a community land trust and thinking about what land really looks like and who owns the land and how do we preserve the land. So this is something that we've been very focused on in partnership with the network or the Center for Community Wealth Building, which is another great asset that we have here in the Denver metro area. But really looking at how can communities come together, how can residents come together and purchase the land, because at the end of the day, who controls the land is really, in at least American society, it's valuable, right? Quote unquote, it's valuable. So really, how do we put the land back into the hands of communities rather than investors and folks that are coming in and purchasing it up because they have the money to do so. So that's just one other thing that I wanted to mention, that there are definitely some creative solutions that are being explored in our region around that.
Thank you. Absolutely. We have one more question from the chat box. Katie is wondering, is the presence of radon part of the warranty for habitability? Sorry.
Yeah, habitability. Confusing. That's a great question. I'm not sure if that is part of it. Let me get with Tiana, our policy director, and see if she has any insights on that. My understanding, and this is just my very brief understanding, is that it might not be in there. We had a difficult time putting mold in there, oddly enough. Mold came with its own questions, basically, from a lot of the legislators, like how do you determine it's too much mold, and what are the particles per unit? So that's a great question. If you have any insights on how we might be able to include that, I would certainly appreciate it, because I know that's probably a question that'll come up. But thank you for that question. I have not thought about radon. So.
Thank you. Feel free, if you have any more questions, please type them into the chat box, or feel free to raise your hand now. We have a few more minutes of Daya's time if anybody else has any questions. I think one more question that I do have for you, Daya. So we've spoken a lot today about all the legislation coming up about renters' rights. Can you speak a little bit to any emphasis on trying to get homeowners to stay in place, particularly thinking about some of our neighborhoods that are higher proportion Latinx owned, thinking about areas like Westwood, et cetera?
Yeah, so the idea of the community land trust, I know, has been brought up a couple of times in Westwood and in other areas, especially for that particular reason, right? This is a form of wealth that has not traditionally been accessed, or because of our systems, we're not traditionally accessed by Latinx and Latino communities. So community land trusts are a couple of ways that we've been exploring. There's also been a push at the state level to explore a housing trust fund to help folks be able to move into that space if they're not currently homeowners. But we know that that's not the only option for a lot of folks. Homeownership may not necessarily feel right for folks at all points. I think the other real opportunity that we have is around the ADUs project that Renee has been putting a lot of effort around, because it starts to build almost another sense of wealth and place keeping. So I think those two conversations hand in hand have been really thinking about that piece, right? How do we help folks stay in place? And while they're staying in place, also have some income to kind of offset the tax burdens and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I know there's been some conversation around it, but we're still trying to think through what this looks like, is thinking about trust funds both at a local level but at the state level. So at the local level, can another region or another city or another county offer a trust fund, for example, to help build affordable housing and to preserve affordable housing? Last I heard, Adams County was exploring that. I'm not quite sure where they're at in that process, but that's definitely something that's been on their radar.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't see any current additional questions in the chat box or hands raised, but I urge all of you, Daya's email is projected on the slide, as well as her partner. She's been mentioning Tiana and Aubrey in these efforts, so I recommend that you shoot them an email if you're interested in connecting further on any of these issues, or, as she mentioned, willing to testify or be more involved in their efforts. I will also put my email in the chat box as well right now, so that if you are not a CPHA member and you'd like the recording or the slides from this presentation, please feel free to just shoot me an email and I will share those with you as well. I want to thank you all for your time today, and particularly you, Daya. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much. And like I said, if folks have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us over your lunch hour, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Daya, this is Jason Botello. I want to thank you again on behalf of the Coalition, and encourage our listeners and Coalition members in your support of testimony or advocacy. Please feel free to advocate on behalf of the Coalition. And if you're not already a member, also contact Marissa to learn more about how you might connect, and I will get in touch. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.